In God whose word I praise, in the Lord whose word I praise, in God alone I trust, I will not be afraid. What can mortal man do to me?
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Preterist Apologetics here on the good old interweb, as the saying goes. Appreciate you being with us. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. It's my good friend, really good friend over here, Mike Sullivan, and we appreciate you being with us. And look, I just want to make a comment here about all the wonderful comments that we're getting, Mike, on our program here. And it's so gratifying to see people getting tuned in to the concepts that we are sharing with them. And there have been, obviously, some folks who differed, but no one's gotten ugly and no one's gotten out of place at all. It's just been, cordial disagreement. But really, really some great comments on what we are sharing. What we're trying to show people is this interconnectedness between the Old Testament and the New.
Sophie.
What what the scholars call the intertextuality. That's the big fancy term for it.
Sit down.
And I've been reading this book right here. I have mentioned this book before, Covenant and Metaphor of Divine Marriage in Biblical Thought. And Sebastian Smolars is the author's name. Excellent, excellent book. And in the introduction to the book, he points out how scholars down through the centuries have really struggled trying to understand how the New Testament writers were using the Old. And you've got some of the greatest scholars of modern theology. Rudolf Bultmann is one of them. And he said, whatever the story of Israel might have been, it is not our story. It is not the Christian story. And what he was saying is, and what Bultmann did was, when he came to the New Testament, he completely divorced it from the promises of Israel. And he said Jesus was drawing on Grecian concepts. Paul was thoroughly Grecian in his approach to Jesus and eschatology and theology, et cetera, et cetera. And you're going, where did he ever get such an idea?
Yeah.
But so many scholars divorced, pun intended, divorced the story of Jesus in the New Testament from the story of Israel.
Don, have you heard, of course, I just finished this lovely book by Bart Ehrman, Armageddon. Have a lot to say about that at another time. But have you heard, speaking of Bart Ehrman, this kind of liberal view that, well, Jesus was kind of sort of developing the Old Testament and he was very Jewish, but Paul, he kind of Hellenized everything, and Paul's theology is completely different than Jesus's or theology. And I'm just like going, where? Give me an example. Like, what are you talking about?
Oh, yeah. And as an auxiliary thought, linked to that is the idea that Paul's the one that created Christianity. Jesus had no intention whatsoever of establishing a, quote, new religion. Well, it's certainly true that Jesus came to teach the true meaning of Torah. No question about that. But he also understood very well that by teaching the true meaning of Torah and by establishing the new covenant, there was going to be some radical changes. It was not going to be Israel of old. And so, yeah, this whole concept that Paul was a Hellenistic guy and that Jesus was thoroughly Jewish, it's actually been around for a good little while. And that basically is what I was talking about with Rudolf Bultmann. Rudolf Bultmann said that Jesus, even Jesus, for crying out loud, who said, do not think that I came to destroy the law of the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. But in reality, you got to understand that Jesus was dealing with Hellenistic thought all the while, and particularly Paul. Paul was a thoroughgoing Grecianized, Hellenized guy. And I'm like you. Where did you get this?
Right.
You don't get this from Paul.
Didn't he study under Gamaliel?
Yes. One of the foremost Jewish scholars of the day. And
Yeah, I
so
think like 1 in 10,000 or something like that could have that privilege. I mean, you had to know the Old Testament scriptures if you were going to be this guy's student. You know what I mean?
absolutely. He didn't accept just any Joe Blow off the street.
Right.
As you're saying, you had to have connections. You had to be known for your knowledge of the scriptures
Right.
before you ever got accepted into his school. So the very idea that Paul was a thoroughgoing Hellenistic Jew just simply will not fly. And there's so much more that can be said about that, but it just shows you, people very often, and we know people like this, both of us, we know people who worship at the feet of scholarship.
Mm.
Now, let's make no mistake, I'm not disparaging, I'm not deriding, and I'm not depreciating the value of scholarship.
Right.
You and I both read scholarship every single day. We
But
appreciate
when it becomes institutionalized and on there, on par with scripture is when we have an issue.
Yeah. Just this last week on on YouTube, this one guy was accosting me and challenging the things that I had to say. And he was just constantly saying, I guess 90% of scholars disagree with you. And of course, part of my response was, well, I guess that 99% of all the Jewish rabbis disagreed with Jesus. So
Right.
what's your point here?
Right. And Deuteronomy 32, which we'll be studying, pretty much prophesied the majority of Israel would not understand her end because she would not understand her scriptures. And as Jesus said, the scriptures speak of me.
Yeah. Well, as Paul said in Acts chapter 13, Paul said, even though the scriptures were read in the synagogue every Sabbath, that the Jews did not understand because they did not hear the voice of the prophets.
Hmm.
And that's exactly what we're talking about here. That when scholarship comes out and declares that the New Testament writers were all Hellenistic and Hellenized, and that they were divorced from the Old Covenant tabernacle or Old Covenant synagogue and Hebraic thought. And let me make this comment. It is so exciting to see over the last 15, 20 years an entire new movement. And I say new, there have been a few scholars along down through time who have always said, guys, stop saying Paul was a Hellenist. Paul was a thoroughgoing Jew.
Mm-hmm.
E.P. Sanders is one of them. E.P. Sanders, Paul and Judaism. E.P. Sanders well understood when you start assigning the creation of Christianity as a Hellenistic religion to Paul, you're completely out of bounds. Paul was a good, faithful, Torah observant as far as he could when he became a Christian Jew. He never abandoned the hope of Israel. Everything that he did was about the hope of Israel.
And so no other things except that which can be found in the law and the prophets.
Exactly right. So my point being, you and I both know people who, if scholars say it, then it's got to be true. And that means preterists are wrong. And yet, what people do not understand, in fact, Thayer, in his Greek English lexicon, in the foreword, he says a word has to be said, and this is a rough paraphrase, but he said a word has to be said here about lexicons as commentaries.
Hmm.
And he said it has to be said that all lexicographers are also commentaries, exactly. The present lexicon included. He said, we as lexicographers do our best to give the actual lexical definitions. But he said, as human beings, we are influenced by our theology. Mm-hmm. And he said, it's almost impossible for us to completely divorce lexical from theology. And he said, that includes this lexicon.
Right.
So he gives you fair warning. And he was honest enough to do that, to realize, hey, look, pick up a lexicon, you appreciate the lexical investigations, the etymological studies, and what have you. Yeah, that's great. But just keep in mind that when these lexicographers start applying the meaning of these words, then they're becoming commentators.
Right. Or if a word has 2 or 3 different meanings, primary and so forth, and you're looking at any given text, if your presupposition and you have a theological bias, you may give it a different meaning in that text because you want your theology to be present there. But again, you have to look at the context. You have to see how the word's used elsewhere in similar. I mean, there's a lot that you have to do. And as Christians, we're all called to be Bereans, folks. Everyone should be studying. It's not just your pastor. And sometimes pastors, you know, we talked about last week, some are very shallow. They got about 2 years worth of sermons, canned sermons, and they do no hermeneutical work, no exegetical work. And so as Christians, we not only need to go through the Bible every year, but we need to be studying it and breaking it down.
Amen to that. I'm sitting here trying to think of which commentator it was. In his foreword to his commentary on Romans, very, very prominent scholar, and it's just completely left me at the moment. But he said in his foreword, unless you are willing to put in hour upon hour upon hour of hard study, not reading, he said there's a great big difference between reading the biblical text and doing exegesis, employing the proper hermeneutic. But he said, and his term was, unless you're willing to invest a lot of blood and sweat and tears into your Bible study, and particularly Romans, then he said, you should never set out to tell anyone what the book of Romans is all about.
Exactly. Especially when you get into Romans 5 to 8, at least. I think those are some of the texts that Peter said, well, Paul teaches some things. Some of them are hard to understand. But
yeah, and it's interesting. I had an interview this, what is this? This is Friday. I had an interview with a fellow from London this week. I think that was on Wednesday night. Yeah, it was Wednesday night. And he told me initially that he wanted to just keep it simple, because he said, keep in mind that my audience is just now learning about covenant eschatology. Now, I got to tell you, this guy is absolutely on fire. He is really on fire. But he's only been at it a short time, right?
right.
And he kept emphasizing to me that I want to keep it simple, Don. I want to keep it simple. And then where did he start asking questions from? Romans 5 to 8.
Come on, break it down. The body of sin, the body of death, the body of flesh. Come on, let's go.
Yeah. And I'm going, you want to keep this simple? and then, of course, he wanted to segue to 1 Corinthians 15.
Oh, right.
And I go, yeah, the simplest chapters in all the Bible.
Yeah. Right.
But the beauty of it was, and I told Jan after the program, I said the beauty of it was that I got to develop Romans chapters 5 through 8 in the context of covenantal contrast in a way that I haven't got to do on hardly any venues before.
Good.
Yeah, I mean, and of course I started with the garden for Romans chapter 5, obviously, and the first Adam, second Adam, all this kind of stuff. But I began with the definition of death. Now, he was familiar with Adam and the sin of Adam. He had never correlated it with Romans 5. As in, Adam, all men sin, 1 Corinthians 15:22, or all men die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive. But when you correlate that with Romans chapter 5, all of a sudden you see this a contrast. As Paul has said, okay, death was in the world. The law entered and endured or stood until Moses. The law entered that sin might abound. So here is the law exacerbating the problem of sin and death,
Magnifying it, yeah.
magnifying it, compounding it, blowing it up. And I said, now begins in Romans chapter 5, 12 to 14, begins this contrast between two covenants. The old law, which has taken the law of sin and death, taken the law of the garden, the sin of the garden, the death of the garden, assimilated it into the law, magnified it, and from the point of the giving of law onward, it was the anticipation of the conquering of that death and the sin. And it was amusing because although he wanted to keep it simple, and I kept trying to simplify it as much as possible as you go down through there, but as I constantly brought it back to the covenantal contrast, you know, his eyes were just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And you could tell that he had never heard the exegesis of Romans 5 to 8 in harmony with 1 Corinthians 15.
And you can't understand 1 Corinthians 15 without knowing Romans 5 through 8 and 2 Corinthians chapter 3 through 7, 6,
Exactly.
around there. If you don't, I mean, if those aren't right there next to you as you're studying 1 Corinthians 15, you'll never understand it. And if you're not looking at the immediate context of Hosea 13, well, all of Hosea and Isaiah, 24 through 28, again, you're not going to understand 1 Corinthians 15. And Don and I are going to head back into our series in 1 Corinthians 15. But right now, do you want to finish your thought on?
No, that's just fine. I was just sharing how amusing it was and how gratifying and fun it was for me to have the opportunity to just march through Romans 5 through 8 and develop it exegetically and then segue directly into 1 Corinthians 15 to show the perfect harmony that Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 is building on every single block that he has laid in Romans 5 to 8, showing that it has nothing whatsoever to do with biological bodies coming out of the grave.
Right.
And I shared, I keep forgetting, it makes me so angry. One of the thoughts that I shared with him was that I asked the question, when the faithful Christian dies today, where do they go? And well, heaven. I said, well, that makes a person a full preterist. Right. Hello. And so I developed that concept. And I said, I want to ask this question. If when we die as a faithful child of God, we get to go to heaven, then upon what basis, why would we ever want to leave heaven where we were without a physical body to come back to earth, dig up, get a physical body out of the ground, go back to heaven where we were, where we didn't need that physical body? And he thought that was hilarious.
Yeah. What advantage would you have if you got this physical body? I mean, and when you ask futurists this, they just go, well, I don't know.
Blah, blah, blah,
You're more complete. Really?
Exactly. And it's interesting that in the comment section, as I was watching, people were responding to that. And I pointed out, and this is where I get frustrated, I always forget whether it was Martin Luther or John Calvin who said, and he was responding to the idea that when we die, we go directly to heaven. And again, it was either Martin Luther or John Calvin. I've got it in my notes. I have to go back and dig it out. But one of the two said, it would be a foolish person indeed to ever want to leave heaven and to come back to earth to get a physical body if when they died, they went to heaven itself. Well, who can argue with that?
I know.
And yet, guess what, folks? That is precisely what futurists argue with. Yeah. 99.9% of all futurists, when you die as a faithful child of God, you'll go directly to heaven.
And some of the church, quote unquote, fathers taught that there was a resurrection of souls or spirits out of Hades into God's presence. Unfortunately, not in AD 70 where the Bible places it, but at the ascension of Christ. And
Ignatius did that. Ignatius said that.
What's that?
Ignatius taught that.
Yes. And so we're just kind of fixing that a little bit and honoring the time statements. All right, guys. So we're in Deuteronomy 32. We're looking at the Song of Moses. We're starting in Deuteronomy 31, verse 29, where Moses says, in your latter days, and in Genesis 49, when Jacob is blessing the tribes, he's talking about in the last days of the sons of Jacob. Okay, this is the last days of Israel. It's not the last days of time. It's not the last days of world history. It's the last days of the nation of Israel, which functions as a type and shadow of the new covenant realities in Christ. And so we've been looking at the Song of Moses and how it's a cornerstone and foundation upon which the Old Testament prophets build upon. And then once we get to the New Testament, Jesus builds upon it, and then the rest of the New Testament authors do. So it is key to understand, and that's why we're spending some time here. Last week, we looked at the Song of Moses in relationship to Isaiah's eschatology. Tonight, we're going to pick up on Daniel. Then if we have time, we'll go into Jesus's development of it as well. Just to remind you some of the themes, we have the last days, we have the rejection of the rock, who when we talked about Isaiah, who's this rock in Isaiah or Deuteronomy 32 that's rejected, that's scoffed at? It is Messiah, Yeshua. Okay, so we have the rejection of the rock. We have in the latter days, there's going to be the specific perverse and crooked generation. When that generation comes, we find out later on in Deuteronomy 32 that the appointed time of Israel's end would be near. And we have covenant curses, we have decreation, we have, Don, just about every element of eschatology, do we not?
We absolutely do. And this is a really, really good example. I've told the story of how the first time I heard David Curtis speak on the feast days, my mind just exploded. I turned to my wife and I said, why have I lived so long and been so ignorant? Well, I feel the same way about my study of the song. When I first began to tap into the beauty, how the song permeates the New Testament. It permeates the prophetic books. And as you said so aptly a little bit ago, it builds through the prophetic books. It brings us to Jesus. And it's the foundation of his ministry. It's the foundation of Pauline theology. And so when I began to see the incredible power of the Song of Moses, it was like, Preston, why did it take you so long, to tap into this? And so I've been going back, rereading just this week, rereading a lot of that J. Ross Wagner's book and elements from it. And his book to me is the best explication of the relationship of Pauline theology, especially in the book of Romans, especially, and the Song of Moses. I mean, every page is just chock full of insights of how Paul is drawing on the song, as well as the Psalms, Psalm 68 especially, and so 69 in the English translations. So anyway, once we get a feel for that interplay, that interconnectedness between the Song of Moses and all of these other books, we cannot help, it seems to me, we cannot help but see the unity of the Scripture. I was raised in an environment in which one of the best ways to study was you drag out your Strong's Unabridged Concordance. And if you really want to learn the Bible, you look up the word kingdom. You look up every single verse where the word kingdom appears. And then you look up faith. Then you look up repentance. Then you look up this. You look up that.
Right.
And instead of taking a holistic view of Scripture, you're cherry picking. You're cherry picking. You're not integrating the narrative you have what I call an atomistic perspective of the Bible. Well, okay, it says this about the kingdom. Well, how does the kingdom relate to the marriage of Israel? What?
Right. The same can be said of systematic theologies. And I've got several: Berkhoff, Hodge, Calvin's Institutes. I've got, a lot of them, and they serve a purpose,
Oh, yeah.
but you can get trapped into the same mindset that you're talking about here, not being able to connect a doctrine as it progresses through scripture, and it becomes a proof texting thing, and not a, I guess protology is the best concept, where you're taking these themes from Genesis all the way through the Bible to Revelation, and you're developing them, and then you see them much more clearly.
Yeah. And before we go on, before we leave Isaiah, I wanted to spend a little bit of time. You've already mentioned the chapters, Isaiah 24 through 28. Isaiah 24 through 28 gives us a snapshot of the Song of Moses
Hmm.
in many, many ways. Deuteronomy chapter 32 has what? A fire that will burn to the lowest hell, and it will consume the mountains or consume the earth. Okay. Isaiah chapter 24, the earth is clean dissolved. The earth is broken up. The inhabitants thereof are scattered, etc., etc. Why? Well, because just like Deuteronomy chapter 32 says, they have provoked me with that which is not a God. Isaiah 24 verse 5, the earth is is totally broken up, clean dissolved. Why? Well, because they have violated the everlasting covenant.
Broken Torah. That's right.
Broken Torah. And then guess what you do? You move into chapter, and I'm going to go very, very briefly into chapter 27, when it talks about the taking away of Israel's sin, which Paul quotes over here in Romans chapter 11, 25 to 27. It's one of his foundational prophecies of the salvation of, quote, all Israel, unquote. And in Isaiah chapter 27, it just as clear could be. And I pointed this out in my debate with Chris Nate. He totally ignored it. By this is the taking away of Israel's sin. When the fortified city is laid desolate, when the altar is turned into chalk stones. And then he said, for this is a people of no understanding. And the people whom the Lord had created will no longer have mercy. He's drawing directly on Deuteronomy 28:38, or excuse me, 32:28. It's a people of no understanding. They do not understand. And here is Yahweh saying in Isaiah 27 that he was going to turn the city into a desolation. The altar would be turned to chalk stone. And this people whom he had created, I wonder how many people he created. This special people that were without understanding. Yet the salvation of Israel, and I never will forget this, I was rather shocked at it. In my book, Elijah has already come, a solution in Romans 11, 25 to 27. I've got an entire chapter devoted to showing that salvation and judgment go hand in hand. They're synchronous events.
Right.
Well, I knew that dispensationalists tried to dichotomize, tried to divide them and say, oh, well, the salvation of Israel stands on its own. That is a temporally isolated event. But then you got the judgment of Israel in AD 70, but the judgment in 70 is not the time of the salvation.
Right.
Okay, so I knew, and Thomas Eismitz makes a big argument about that. But I had assumed that most amillennialists and most postmillennialists realized that salvation and judgment went hand in hand. They're synchronous events. So nonetheless, I devoted an entire chapter to that. A friend of mine who was at the time studying for his doctorate, I'd sent him a copy of the book, asked him to look at it. And he wrote back and he said, Don, this chapter is absolutely brilliant. Okay, well, thank you very much, but I thought you already knew that.
Right.
He said, no, this is something that's not recognized.
Which is crazy, because Matthew 3, you look at John the Baptist's eschatology, and even Jesus in the next chapter, whenever they're saying the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven is at hand or it's near, he links it to the judgment, and you have a salvation for the remnant, and you have the judgment of those who have hardened their hearts. And they go
It's
together.
everywhere.
I don't know why this is complicated.
I don't either. That's why I say it. It surprised me when this guy, scholar, said, this is brilliant. This is not something that's widely recognized. I go, why not? But
Well, I think it's because people, especially Christians, think in terms of salvation only at the cross. They don't understand, especially if they're denying that the second coming is taking place when it's supposed to, in AD 70, at the end of the Old Covenant age. They don't understand how AD 70 has anything to do with salvation. And it's very rare. I mean, you'll find it in Joel McDermott a little bit. You'll find it a little bit in Ken Gentry there in Revelation 21, where there's no sea, always taking away sin. And you'll see a little bit of it, but they don't want to go too far, because then they give the farm away.
That's to say, yeah, that's a mouthful. It's a huge, huge understatement. And I've got to tell you, I can't wait to get Kenneth Gentry's 2-volume book on Revelation. I mean, it's supposed to be at the printer. I don't know when they're going to ship them, but I placed my pre-order, a good little while back. As soon as I saw the announcement, it's just like, yeah, send that to me, because I want that. I want to see how he builds on his earlier statements in his "He shall have dominion." For instance, in Revelation chapter 10, 6 and 7, that in the sounding of the seventh trumpet, the mystery of God is finished. That which was spoken by the prophets. Okay.
Right.
Well, guess what Kenneth Gentry says that is? He says the seventh trumpet signals that the end of the temple cultus and national Israel is about to come. Well, wait a minute. The seventh trumpet is the resurrection of Revelation 11, 15, and following. And
that's what I want to see. I want to see how he deals with verse 18 of Revelation 11, which they always fly over. Absolutely. Now, you would think in a 2-volume set that he can't do that, but I mean,
Peter Leithart does.
Peter Leithart has a 2-volume set, and he flies over stuff as well.
He does the Passover.
Yeah.
On Revelation 11, 18. I mean, he's got some tremendous comments about when is the mystery of God finished. Well, it's when the blood of the martyrs was vindicated. Okay, thank you. We appreciate that. You're exactly right. When is the blood of the martyrs vindicated? Oh, at the end of the millennium, which you say hasn't come yet. Holy cow.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it's, as you know, Mike, it's sometimes very frustrating to pick up these outstanding scholars who do such a marvelous job right up to a point. And then they completely abandon their hermeneutic. They completely abandon the text, and they just jump ship and talk about the end of time. Doug Wilson does that in his book, When the Man Comes Around. He does a really good job on Revelation 11, 15, and following. He does a real good job into Revelation 19. Oh, but then, see in chapter 20, we got this really long period of time. Oh, but wait a minute. After he talks about the millennium, Jesus is coming real soon. And he did in AD 70.
Right.
So it really, truly is frustrating to read this take place, knowing that these men they absolutely had to be struggling with it. But they knew, I mean, when Kenneth Gentry says in his book, Navigating the Book of Revelation, a little short book, when he says, contrary to popular opinion, Revelation 21, the new heaven and new earth coming down from God out of heaven, the tabernacle of God is with men. Contrary to popular opinion, that's not talking about the eternal state. That's talking about Christ marrying the New Covenant church in AD 70. Okay, thank you. You just surrendered the whole book.
So I don't remember Gentry ever saying that we're still in a betrothal period. I always read partial preterists to say that the divorce of Old Covenant Israel took place in AD 70. The marriage has taken place, and then the feast follows the wedding, right? Jewish weddings. I mean,
No,
that's how I've
Gentry
understood
says the
Gentry.
wedding was in AD 70. He
So
says,
then you have Wilson trapped with this. And so now he's saying that there's a double fulfillment of what Gentry says there can be no double fulfillment.
no,
This is not talking about the eternal state. It's talking about a covenantal transition. And we have Gentry saying the wedding took place then, and now we're having Wilson understanding the problem with this because it's connected to the resurrection of Isaiah 25, 6-9. So he's completely, of course, this is not uncommon for these guys.
well, that's a huge understatement. And you and I both know this, and we pointed out in our respective writings and presentations. And listen, you and I also know that these men are acutely aware of how you and I and others expose their inconsistencies. It's one of the reasons they refuse to debate us.
Right.
I've said this many times. Kenneth Gentry knows that if he were to debate either you or me, and he's been challenged to debate me probably 20 times, and he's always too busy. Okay, well, he knows that if he were to get into a debate with me, whether it would be a written debate or whether it would be a YouTube debate or what it might be, he would not be debating Don Preston. He would be debating Kenneth Gentry versus the scriptures.
Right.
And that's a really tough thing to do. It's really a tough thing to do.
If he were debating me, not only would he be debating himself, he would be debating his partial preterist system, which goes with Joel McDermott, Gary DeMar, Peter Lightheart, John Owen, John Lightfoot. He would have to deal with his system as well as what he has written. But that's why he does not want anything to do with this. That's why he does. Doug Wilson doesn't. Doug Wilson has backed out of two things with me. One, a one-on-one debate that he said he was going to think about, but he had some personal things, and then he'd get back with me. Then all of a sudden he got too busy again. Then we had the documentary that we were going to do with you and him and me, and he backed out of that. And it's just how you can't milk this. I'm too busy for if it's a year or two, maybe, but when it becomes 15, 20 years, you can't use that card anymore.
Well,
it's expired.
Yeah, in the case of Gentry, we know that he has debated some other men. He's debated an amillennialist during that period of time. And so while he can find the time to do what he wants to do,
right,
he cannot find the time to debate us. That's the bottom line. And once again, we both know, there's no question about this, he is very, very well aware of the work that we are doing in exposing his positions. For instance, I've written numerous articles on academia.edu. I recently wrote a response to Elton Holland, a friend of mine who's a scholar, who wrote a critique of the full preterist view. Well, guess what? I've gotten notification that Kenneth Gentry has read my critique, my response to Elton Holland. He has read some of my other articles. So Kenneth Gentry could never plead ignorance of what I'm saying, of what I've written. He knows about my books, but he most assuredly has got to know, guess what? Preston knows I've been reading his articles. That's undeniable. And all the more reason that he doesn't want to debate us. Well, okay, let's move on. And let's get into Daniel and the appointed time.
Yes. Well, why don't we start with the last days, right? Because we have the last days, Deuteronomy 31:29, Then we have the last days, Daniel chapter 2. He kind of sets it off. Then we have the stone cut without hands. The kingdom comes during the Roman Empire. So we have a development, right? What's I don't want to say vague in Moses's eschatology. It starts to getting more and more clear once we get to Isaiah, and now even more clear in Daniel, because now all of this is going to take place in the fourth kingdom, the fourth empire, the Roman Empire. All of this, the last days, who the Messiah is gets clear. And then you're right, the appointed time.
And this is one of the reasons. I've forgotten whether we talked about it last week or if it was on another interview. I've been so busy lately, I don't hardly know which world I'm in, which is a good thing. It's a good thing, but I kind of lose track of what show I discuss this or that on. But here's a point that I made. When you talk about the book of Daniel, you're talking about a book. The Dead Sea community absolutely looked upon the book of Daniel as a prophetic book.
Yes, they did.
No question about it. But guess what the Jews do? The Jews, my friend in Israel that I have mentioned repeatedly, Reuven Bronner is his name. Reuven Bronner has told me modern day rabbis do not consider Daniel to be a prophet of God.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because it destroys their whole religion.
Boom. Listen, and he's a wonderful guy. I love corresponding with him. Boy, he's on edge right now with all of this. Boy, all this conflict going on over there, and rightfully so. I mean, you've got the possibility of Iran shooting hundreds of missiles at you, and Israel's not a very big place. And as much as he and I disagree theologically, clearly so, it's still, you've got to commiserate with somebody who's living in a country that another country wants to wipe you off the face of the earth. That's scary stuff. It's really scary stuff.
It is.
But he's told me repeatedly, the modern Jew does not consider Daniel to be a prophet of God. Well, again, the reason that's true, folks, and you have to catch the power of this, the reason the ancient Jews,
real Jews that could tell you what tribe they were from and prove it.
Absolutely. Great point. Back when there were genealogies, back when they could go in to do in the days, like they did in the days of Ezra, when the remnant returned from Babylonian captivity, and a search of the record was found that here are some men who wanted to be priests, and a search of the records was made, and their names were not in the records, therefore they were not allowed to be priests. That's Ezra chapter 2, 62 and 63. Well, okay, where is the Jew today? I'll use the term Jew. Where is the Jew today that can go to the records, look up their name and say, I am descended from Aaron and from Levi. I am in the Levitical lineage. I can be a priest. So how do they do that today? Well, my friend told me, because I asked him very pointedly last year. I said, since there are no genealogies, how does anybody going about to prove that they would be qualified to be a Levite should a temple ever be rebuilt? He said, well, basically our position is if somebody claims they're a Levite, we take their word for it. I mean, wait a minute. I am the son of Bill Gates. You're going to take my word for that?
There's a gal I've been sometimes interacting with, not a lot, but Naomi Wolf. She was on Tucker Carlson. Really good investigative reporter, but she's Jewish, knows Hebrew, does some videos, and she was talking about the angel of the Lord. I said, Naomi, can you tell me who the angel of the Lord is? Can you tell me who Melchizedek is? Can you tell me who the Son of Man is in Daniel? And give me the Jewish concept of the two powers of heaven. Develop for me various views. And Daniel 7:13, the next verse, 14, says that this Son of Man will be worshipped. And that Aramaic word for worship is worship, because everywhere it's used in Daniel, it's worship. It's not just some, general serve.
Homage.
And I said, can you do this? And I haven't got a reply yet, but this is why the modern Jews do not really care for Daniel.
No.
Because Daniel gives that doctrine of the two powers of heaven, where Messiah is eternal, he's divine, and he's a son of man coming on the clouds. They did not know how to wrap their head around that. And here's Jesus saying, yeah, that's me. That's his favorite title.
I know.
That's his
32 times in the New Testament.
He does not refer to himself as son of David. The only time you will see that is in Revelation. Anywhere in the Gospels, Jesus never. He says, I'm the Lord of Psalm 110, and I'm the Son of Man of Daniel. And I am. I mean,
I am the Alpha and the Omega. I am the beginning and the end. Yes. I am the Pantocrator.
And he was very Jewish. You talk about these liberals that are saying, well, Jesus was Jewish. Yeah, well, let's develop that a little bit. How Jewish was he when he claimed to be deity?
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Daniel chapter 2, you've already touched on it. We have the delineation of 4 empires that would come, the last being the days of the Roman Empire. And in the day, and by the way, this is set within the context of the last days. Now, folks, that's a direct echo back to the Song of Moses about the last days, and Deuteronomy 31:29 as well. So when you see these prophetic books using this terminology that spring up in the Hebrew patriarchs, talking about the future times, the time of Messiah, the time of salvation, the time of the kingdom, and now here are the prophetic books using all that terminology. And as Mike has said so well, now they're refining that. You can look at it almost like a funnel. You start bringing it down, bringing it down, bringing it down. And now we have a time frame given.
Mm-hmm.
And folks, make no mistake about it. One of the reasons why, we just talked about it a moment ago, one of the reasons why modern day Judaism rejects Daniel is because it gives such a, quote, specific, no, it doesn't give the day and hour, but it gives a kingdom, a time of a kingdom when Messiah and the kingdom was to be established. Now, I think we need to point out right here that in John chapter 1, I believe it's starting about verse 30. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes go out to John the Baptizer. And they say, are you the Messiah? Nope. Well, are you the prophet? No. Who are you? I'm the voice of one crying in the wilderness. Well, that alone, I mean, that alone carries with it such incredible messianic overtones. It's him admitting he's not Messiah. But guess what? When he says, he's the voice of one crying in the wilderness, that comes obviously from Isaiah chapter 40. The voice of one crying in the wilderness said, prepare ye in the desert a highway for our God. Fill up every valley, make every mountain low. Make a highway in the desert for our God. Folks, when I found out what kind of language that is warfare language.
Mm-hmm.
That is invasion language. And I will use the terminology that the scholars do sometimes. In the case of Isaiah 40, this is the holy war language. And here's what it means. In the ancient world, and especially, well, it started with the Assyrians, to be sure, and it carried through all the way through the Babylonians, carried through with the Greeks. When their army was going to invade another country, they would send out platoons, squads, groups of soldiers who would literally build a highway for their war machines. Josephus, in Wars of the Jews, as he speaks about the siege of the city Jotapata, he says Vespasian sent out his road builders, and they cleared the highway. They cleared a highway. They took out the boulders from the way. They cut out the trees. They made highways for the movement of the Roman army so that they could travel with speed.
Yeah, they could take their battering rams, all their military equipment needed a flat road.
Exactly. And so when we're told that John the Baptizer is saying, prepare you in the desert a highway for our God, make straight his paths in the desert, fill up the valleys, lower the hills. This is the coming of the Lord in judgment. It's not talking about it's not talking about the coming of Jesus as the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 or Isaiah 42, where it describes him as, a smoking reed he shall not quench, a broken reed he shall not break. No, that's the suffering servant.
Well, even Messiah ben Joseph, the Jewish concept of the suffering Messiah. But if you read how Moses describes Messiah ben Joseph in the next chapter 33, verse 16 and 17, again, he is this domesticated firstborn shore ox or bull that, according to Leviticus, was destined to be sacrificed. But then he says he will be transformed, which implies resurrection. He will be transformed into a ram ox, completely different animal. These things were almost the size of an elephant, folks. Okay. Julius Caesar saw one in the Black Forest and wrote all about it. They hated humans. If they saw you, they would destroy you. Just about every civilization just reverenced these beasts. And he says, he's not just a suffering servant, Messiah ben Joseph, but he's going to be transformed into this mighty ox, and he's going to gore the nations of the earth. He's going to conquer. So I just want to throw that in real quick.
It's really fascinating that you're talking about those bulls, the ruarch,
shore or firstborn shore.
Yeah. Anyway, I was telling Jan about them just today as we were going down to Texas. I was telling her about how desirable they were. The Romans used them in the gladiatorial fights, and Hitler wanted to breed them back into existence because of their ferocity. He wanted to use them as a symbol for the German might and all this kind of stuff. He couldn't do it.
Right.
But yeah, the point is they were extremely ferocious, extremely violent animals. So yeah, all of this imagery comes into play with the voice of the wilderness. Okay. So here you have all of these concepts coming into play. Here's the point that I was making with John the Baptizer. As he's out there in the wilderness, he said, I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness. He was saying to them, I'm giving you warning, folks. The axe is already at the root. Matthew chapter 3, 10 to 12. He has the winnowing fork, which is the symbol of the end of harvest, not the beginning of it.
Resurrection.
So now John is saying, I am not Messiah. I'm the voice of one crying in the wilderness. But they keep asking him, are you the one that we are looking for? Greek word prostekomai, or prostekao, which means an eager, expectant, looking for. Now, why would they use such a word if they didn't have a concept of the appointed time for the Messiah?
Yes. And we understand from 11Q Melchizedek, they were taking Daniel's 90 weeks as 10 Jubilee periods. And they were, according to my calculations, and I'm no mathematician, but it's not hard to do. They understood Messiah was supposed to come anywhere between AD 17 to AD 28. That's when the beginning of that 10th Jubilee would start. depending on how you calculate it and what year, you know, whether it was 422 or 424. And so that's why. I mean, it was the time of the Roman Empire. Messiah doesn't come outside of the Roman Empire.
That's right.
Right. And that's why you have these Jews downplaying and trying to get rid of Daniel now, because they know some of their rabbis said, well, if Messiah didn't come, he will never come. That's strong language.
Oh, yeah. Daniel chapter 2. It gets better from Daniel chapter 2 about this appointed time of Deuteronomy chapter 32, the Kairos, the appointed time.
Chapter 32, verse 35 in the Septuagint, we're talking.
Yes, exactly. Thanks for that clarification. Now, look what happens in Daniel chapter 7. And look, folks, how many times do we talk about people hearing video after video after video after video? Oh, well, the man of sin, he's alive. You know, we're close to Armageddon. It's just around the corner. A guy on Facebook told me last week that next week we're going to see dramatic unfolding of God's plan. It will be evident to everyone.
Don, do you get to the point where sometimes you just sit there and go, this is like a totally different religion?
Yeah.
I mean, these guys have twisted the scriptures to where they're just not even understandable. I mean, it's just it's a cult. It's something totally different than what the scriptures.
And in regard to this individual that I'm talking about, I won't call his name, but he said it will very, very soon be revealed who's right and who's wrong. He was talking about him or me, because he said. He said, we have Michael, the archangel, with us personally, and you don't. So it will soon be revealed that you're wrong. I'm going,
well, is he talking to Michael?
Okay.
Yeah. But think about this. Now, a lot of people are going, Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, right? What's going on with him? Well, he's taking photos with John Hagee.
Scares me to death.
It scares me to death. Folks, bad eschatology has really, really bad consequences.
Oh,
this guy has no problem spending all of our money in the name of being a conservative to give it away to do these wars so he can usher in the rapture. And these guys begin having a messianic complex. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu does have a messianic complex because in their theology, their John the Baptist is a military leader. He fights, he destroys, he clears the way for the temple to be built, right? Mm-hmm. So in their eschatology, Talmudic eschatology, that some of them refer to Benjamin Netanyahu as the John the Baptist, as one who prepares the way. Or they think he is the Messiah because, again, he's a military leader. He wipes out the enemies, prepares the way to rebuild the temple and bring everyone back into the land. And so when you have this Zionist eschatology, they are bleeding us financially, and they're bleeding our sons and daughters, sending them over there to fight in wars that really, it comes down to really bad eschatology and theology.
You and I both have been saying this for years and for years. You cannot look upon eschatology as an ivory tower, abstract theological discussion that has no impact on everyday life.
Right.
America has lost thousands of its young men and women because of bad eschatology. And when you look at the dispensational world. Now, look, I know that so many good people, they're sincere, but sincerity does not negate the seriousness of the doctrine. Let's just face it. You may be as good-hearted and love the Lord and all that kind of stuff, but if you vote for people who are devoutly Zionistic and who believe that America must support Israel no matter what she does, even to the point of killing Christian Palestinians for crying out loud, because after all, that's her land. And Israel has a right to do whatever's necessary, even if that means booting Christians off of their property, because it doesn't belong to them. When you vote for those who have that philosophy, you are aiding and abetting the shedding of innocent blood.
Well, Don, I'm
That's
to the
strong
point.
language, I know, but it's the truth.
I'm to the point where just paying our taxes, Don. I mean, and I get frustrated. I'm going to meet with Tim Burchett. He's a congressman here in Tennessee. I'm supposed to meet with him today, but he's still in Washington trying to deal with Mayorkas. But I want to talk to him about some of this stuff. And even Marsha Blackburn's really good, but she's again one of these Christian Zionists. And, you know, she's blaming Biden for wasting our tax money to support Iran. But she wants to give our tax money to support Israel. So you look at it, our tax money, we're being bled financially on purpose, by the way.
Mhm.
All right, because that digital CBD world currency that's what all this is about, bleeding us, destroying us from within financially. And we're supporting Iran and we're supporting Israel.
It's a vicious cycle.
And none of us, most of us don't want that. And, you know, we had a revolution over, you know,
Taxation
England
without
taking away
representation.
our rights to print our own currency and over taxation. And I'm looking at, we're going to get to a climax in this country where we're like, we don't want you taking our hard-earned money to support these wars that have nothing in the name of the Bible. At some point, there's going to be something's going to hit the fan, I think.
Well, and I'm one of these that I just shudder to think of that possibility. And so what we've got to do, men like you, myself, and a growing number of others, we have got to impress on people the absolute necessity for correcting the errors of bad eschatology.
Right.
And that it's got to become a grassroots movement in which we are confronting, you know, we are absolutely confronting the errors that are killing our young men and women and costing us gazillions of dollars.
You know what, Don? I've realized my 35 years of studying, almost 35 years of studying this. I look at us as like Ruth. God raised you up for such a time as this. And this is why. It's not enough to be like an Alex Jones, where you've been studying the New World Order for 30 years. And you can explain it to our politicians now. You can connect the dots. But if your eschatology is bad, it doesn't matter. You're still being led down a road that is going to bring this about because your eschatology is bad. And here's the funny thing. Even if you understand modern Israel is not a fulfillment of or God doing this, God blessing Israel, that we're to bless modern day Israel. But if you're still thinking, yeah, that's the synagogue of Satan, and you're thinking that we still need a national Israel and we still need a rebuilt temple for the Antichrist to come in, it's two sides of the same coin. You still need a national Israel. You still need another rebuilt temple in your eschatology. So it doesn't matter if you criticize national Israel or you think it's just the greatest thing on earth that we're supposed to bless them so we're not in sin. That mindset, either one, leads us down this road of quote unquote Armageddon. And that's why I see God raising up the preterist view. Just at the same time, the Rockefellers are funding the German higher critical movement, and the Rothschilds begin funding the Zionists, the Darby and Schofield. That's about the same time that preterist God says, okay, I'm going to do something. I'm going to take my little remnant here. I'm going to put the truth in there, and it's going to go right alongside it. And at some point, all of this is going to climax. And I'm excited to kind of see what's going to happen. But
I started to say we're living in some incredibly exciting times. We really are. And it looks to me like we're out of time, Mike.
We are.
But we want to pick up on Daniel chapter 7, since we mentioned the man of sin, all that.
Okay.
We want to talk about the appointed time, the man of sin, and the coming of the Son of Man, because all of these, look, ask any dispensationalist, hey, is the coming of the Son of Man and the man of sin, are all these interrelated? Well, absolutely. Well, guess what? The appointed time destroys dispensationalism.
Sure
Okay.
does. That and the
All
fact that the man of sin was alive when Paul wrote, just a minor detail there.
Yeah, small detail. All right.
All right, brother. Well, we'll see you next Friday. And guys, thank you so much for tuning in for another episode of Preterist Apologetics. And we'll see you next week.
Amen.
And we'll see you at the conference. Hopefully, I will be lecturing on Deuteronomy 32, and also another lecture on messianic expectations and how Jesus fulfills a better Moses, a better Joshua, a better Joseph, Melchizedek, and the Son of Man. And hopefully I'll have time to develop all of those. We'll see.
You won't.
Thanks, Don.
All right. Good night, brother.
All right. Take it easy.
That I may walk before my God in the light, in the light, in the light of life, 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 in the